Hello everyone. Today I'm going to do a speech analysis on What to the Slave is the 4th of July by Frederick Douglass. The speech was delivered by Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York on July the 5th, 1852. Frederick Douglass was the best known and most influential African American leader of the 1800s. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland, but managed to escape to the North. After writing his autobiography in 1845, Douglass started a newspaper dedicated to the anti-slavery cause. In 1847, Douglass raised enough money to buy his own freedom as a free man. He settled in Rochester, New York. In 1852, the leading citizens of Rochester asked Douglass to give a speech as part of their 4th of July celebrations. Douglass accepted their invitation and gave his speech on July the 5th. At that time, many white Americans believed that African Americans were inferior to fully human. Even Northerners who were anti-slavery did not necessarily support abolition. Many were content to let Southerners continue to hold slaves and regarded it as a right upheld by the Constitution. In such background, Douglass' proposition in the Independence Day speech mainly is that slavery is wrong and should be eliminated. Throughout Douglass speaking about who to the slave is the Independence Day, I see Douglass used several rhetorical devices and strategies for convincing arguments. First, Douglass often used rhetorical questions throughout his speech in order to make a point. For example, he started by asking several questions to start a discussion, such as, what have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Actually, in sarcastic context, these questions as negative assertions are intended to mean that black people should not celebrate national independence, since they do not have freedom and justice. Sometimes Douglass used parallelism, asking rhetorical questions to remind the audience of his intended messages, such as, for who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to the claims of gratitude, that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? Who so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujah of a nation's jubilee? Douglass was a former slave and a leader of abolition. Based on his statutes, Douglass used authoritative argument for getting the audience to see him as credible, from the slave's point of view. He spoke out strongly against slavery, such as, I do not hesitate to declare, with all my soul, that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. As a leader of abolition, Douglass presented his credibility by using solid arguments to commend the hypocrisy of a nation celebrating freedom and independence, while nearly a million humans were being kept as slaves. Douglass spoke out directly, your celebration is a shame to the American slave. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. Douglas further pointed out a political assumption mainly related to abolition. Men have a natural right of freedom, reminding the audience that freedom should not be taken for granted for all men. In addition, Douglas used logical argument to appeal the audience to re-examine their judgment on black men blinded by prejudice by giving convincing evidence. For example, he stated that there are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of these same crimes will subject a white man to like punishment. In another example, Douglas used logical processes to call the audience attention to an unfair point about a slave. For example, he stated that thousand statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read and write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beast of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. On the other hand, Douglas used emotional argument, creating emotional responses to the slave's great hardship and suffering to persuade the audience into his proposition. Slavery is wrong and should be eliminated. For example, he used a series of parallelism strongly invoking pity on the slaves, to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to the masters. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce everything that serves to persuade slavery, the great sin and shame of America. In addition, Douglas also used imagery to create miserable picture in his audience's mind for appealing their sympathies, such as the sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought strips and death to me. I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. In conclusion, Douglas used several rhetorical devices and strategies in his speech. What to the slave is the 4th of July for convincing arguments about abolition. He used rhetorical questions as negative assertions to start a discussion and make a point about the Independence Days, used authoritative argument against slavery for getting the audience to see him as credible from the slave's point of view, used a political assumption stressing freedom for all men, used logical argument to call the audience to re-examine their unfair point about the slave, and used emotional argument to persuade the audience by creating emotional responses to slave suffering. While using these arguments, Douglas often used parallelism, strongly evoking pity on slaves, or used imagery, creating a miserable picture for appealing the sympathies. Throughout his speech, Douglas has applied rhetorical devices and strategies to argue against slavery. And that's it. Thank you.